This week on the Midlife Awareness Podcast.
Metaphor creates reality. And if somebody says, well, is it metaphorical or is it real? You're lost. The opposite to metaphorical is literal. The opposite to real is unreal. Metaphor creates reality if lived.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Midlife Awareness Podcast. I thank you for hanging in there with us. And today we have another special treat with us as the first, actually, writer to come on the podcast is with us again today. Our good friend, Dominic Crossan, is with us today. Dom, how you doing, buddy?
It's very good to be back with you, Dennis. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, very much so. And it's good to have you back on. And you just got done writing a book, and it is out now for everybody to go out and get. And it's another book on Paul. It's called Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization. Two personal questions, I guess, to start and kick this off right away is, do you think you're done?
Okay, I'm 90 years and 6 months about. Okay. Now, thank God I'm in good health and good energy, but, sunset is sunset and sunsets can be beautiful, but they're still sunsets. So I don't know the honest truth. I didn't know I was going to write this book before I really started into it. It was not planned. And I would tell your listeners, basically, I'm interested in the historical Jesus. I'm interested in the historical Paul only, honestly, insofar as he is talking about Jesus, of course, as the Messiah, Christ, as he would call him. So I'm interested in, for example, Paul talks about resurrection. I think that's about Jesus. Now, whether you take it as a metaphor or literal, it's a claim about Jesus. So if you're talking about an historical figure and people are making claims about him, like they do of Caesar, that he ascended among the gods, okay, I consider that something you have to discuss. Now, you may say, I think that's ridiculous. I think he's buried in Rome somewhere. Fine. But part of his legacy is surely part of his history. If you've suddenly discovered Jesus, he's never been heard of in 2,000 years, and you dug up Mark's gospel somewhere in the Levant, I think that would be major news. So basically, Paul is part of Jesus for me.
One of the things that I've been kind of amazed in reading a lot of your stuff is you come up with some of the neatest titles for your books. This one again, Paul the Pharisee. And I know when people see that, they're going to probably run screaming to the hills and stuff like that, because you don't ever, first of all, Pharisee in the Bible has a real bad connotation. And we're going to go through the differences and how actually most people get Pharisee, what is a Pharisee, and how we get it wrong. But Paul the Pharisee, how do you come up with these titles? Do you come up with them? Is it just, some experience, or how do you do that?
And basically, it's my title. And even all the books I've ever written, I've usually fought for the title because I want a title that summarizes it. So if for example, I'm not talking about you, but I've been on book tours, and if the interviewer hasn't even read the book, which I'm not even criticizing. Okay, I've happened on book tours. If he says, Paul the Pharisee, what does that mean? I'm off and running.
Right.
If I have a title like that, I can take it from there if you've never read the book, and we just have a conversation. So in any case, I came up with that because it's, I think, almost like a cliche in scholarship at the moment that Paul must be handled as a Jew, not as if he left Judaism and converted to Christianity, which wasn't really established yet. But I'm going one step farther. This is not the new Paul the Pharisee. This is the new Paul, the Pharisaic Jew. Of course he's a Jew. Of course he's a Jew. All Pharisees were. But that's not enough. What type of a Jew was he? There was Essenes, there was Pharisees, there were Sadducees, there were Jews in favor of violence against Rome, revolt, there were Jews in favor of non-violence against Rome. it's kind of condescending to say in the first century or the 21st century, somebody is a Jew as if somehow they're all the same. Everyone's the same. Or they say about me, I'm Irish. Yeah, I'm Irish. But that doesn't tell you much. It tells you something accurate, but it's where you begin, not where you end. So, Pharisee, I'm stressing that. And I would say, picking up what you mentioned, if you go to the New Testament, the Pharisees are like, this is the libel, nitpicking legalists and hypocrites. That's what they're called. Matthew calls, probably he may be a Pharisee himself, he calls his fellow Pharisees hypocrites. And he has Jesus say it, which is worse. Now, that's libel. And it's the infighting that happens when two groups are too close to one another. So in the New Testament, you don't hear a word about the Essenes. They're
Right.
down at Qumran, mind their own business. We're not mad at them. Forget them. Don't even mention them. The Sadducees, oh yeah, you'll hear about them in Jerusalem at the death of Jesus. Yeah, they're the high priests. Yeah. But the Pharisees seem to be all over the place. Every bush in Galilee seems to have Pharisees behind them. That tells me that this is a fight within the family. This is a fight for the center, not for the left wing or the right wing, as it were. I think of the Sadducees as the right wing and the Essenes as the left wing. That's just my simplicity. So I take everything that's said about the Pharisees in the New Testament, not with a grain of salt, but something like a ton of salt. And to find out who the Pharisees are, I go to Josephus,
Hmm.
who talks about the Sadducees, the Essenes, and I think he is more or less neutral on this. He's not attacking the Sadducees. He's a priest himself, so he's pretty respectful to the people down at Qumran, the Essenes. I would say he's impartially telling you about these three types, except, of course, they're all just philosophies. Dear Romans, these are not political religious factions. Oh, do we just do philosophy, dear Romans? Okay, that's fine. That's making them all not dangerous to Rome. So go to Josephus if you want to find out what a Pharisee is.
Now, you had kind of mentioned a little bit about the Pharisees were known for their interpretation of the law, their very strict interpretation of the law. Um, and you had also mentioned that these Pharisees were Jews. So I'm assuming then that the law that we're talking about is Jewish law, or do they get into Roman law and
No,
or anything else like that?
no, you're quite right, Dennis. We're talking about the Torah.
Okay.
And here's the great irony. You're just reading now Josephus. He mentions too that they're very faithful to tradition, is his word. He doesn't say just law, but faithful to tradition. And the second thing he says about them, that's the first thing. The second thing is they have this theory. Let me just say the word resurrection. Now, I would ask all of us, including myself, don't presume we know what that means. We're just reading it as it were for the first time. We're reading it in Josephus. We've never heard of Jesus, let's say. So these Pharisees are very faithful to tradition and they believe in the resurrection. Now, excuse me, if I'm a Sadducee, I'm going to say, excuse me, dear Pharisee, where in the tradition is the resurrection mentioned? Show me the Torah. Your traditions, show me where you got that. Tell me any prophet who talked about it. Show it in the books of wisdom. This is the supreme irony that they're claiming tradition, but resurrection is a brand new idea. You can kind of date it for about 160 years before the time of Jesus, from the time of the Maccabean martyrs. And we might get into that too. But they're going to have to claim, where did you get that? If I'm arguing with Pharisees and I'm not calling them names, I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, there's the written law from Mount Sinai. There's also the oral law. And we have the oral law, and we are faithful to the tradition of the oral law, dear Sadducees, and you just have the written law. So gotcha. They have to say that because there is the whole of the Old Testament, basically, for all practical purposes, of the Jewish scriptures, takes it for granted that when you die, you go down to Sheol and it's all over. Get over it. Now, while you're here on earth, God rewards and punishes here on earth, according to Deuteronomy. Love, obey the Lord your God, all will go well. Disobey the Lord your God, all will go badly. It's all sanctions are on earth. For example, we all know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. He's faithful to God. He's put in the lion's den. All the lions turn into pussycats. The three men in the fiery furnace, same thing. Faithful to God, pray to God. And what do they have? Instead of a fiery furnace, they have, what would I call it? A warm sun. They have to put on sunscreen, as it were. I understand that. They're explaining how the world works in terms of here and now. But you can actually date the time. And I said it's the time of the Maccabean martyrs. How does that work for a martyr? Tell me how a martyr is being punished for his sins by being put to death for being faithful to the law. So you can date the time of the Maccabean martyrs. The Deuteronomic, I was going to say faith or Deuteronomic explanation, shifts to the next life. So that's what it is. It's not that Daniel in the lion's den will always be saved, but if the lions kill him, in the next life he'll be rewarded. So the entire Jewish tradition shifts gear, and you can watch it actually in the book of Daniel, because the second half of the book of Daniel doesn't talk at all about that. It talks about the next life. Some here will rise. So wait a minute now. We got a brand new idea around 160, something called resurrection. I'm not presuming we know what it means. No, we don't. What does it mean? We're talking to a Pharisee, let's say, we're talking to Paul before he ever heard about this guy, Jesus. He's never heard of him, okay? He just graduated as a Pharisee, summa cum laude. Well, that's Latin, so he probably have to do it in Greek. Anyway, Paul, tell me what this resurrection thing is. I've never heard this word. I'm an open-minded Greco-Roman philosopher. I don't know the word. I've never heard of it. I understand about ascension. Yeah, we understand people go up to the gods like Caesar, but you're talking about resurrection. Resurrection is about cosmic justice. It's not about whether you or I or anyone, when we die, as Plato said, the soul goes either to, I'm using my terminology now, either to heaven or to hell or to purgatory. Plato had three states for the soul. It either goes into bliss, let's call it, or horror, let's call it, or it goes into a purging process to be worthy of going into bliss. So that was already there from Plato. But now, what about the world? That's cosmic. That's not cosmic, that's individual. So what the brilliant novelty of the Pharisees is, are we responsible for the world? Or is it just about me and you, and when we die, we're going to be all sanctioned, and we'll all go to heaven, and we'll all go to hell? Their claim is at the end of time now, every human being who has ever lived will individually rise up to be judged in a great big cosmic judgment. Now, I'm always tempted to kind of smile and say, oh, come on. Of course, what about cannonballs? No, but right. Hold it for the moment, because we're not taking it literally. We're just trying to see what it says. It's telling us there is not just individual justice, which has been there since the time of Plato, in the next life, of course. And it's not just you go down to Sheol and whatever. There is a cosmic justice operational in the world. Now, it's kind of deferred till the end of time. So if the end of time ain't coming soon, it's not much of an operation. but they're arguing that there's a cosmic justice and every one of us is responsible for what we've done to the world. Now, Paul's great jump from Phariseeism into becoming a messianic Christic, I'm not saying Christian, by the way, I'm saying
Right.
Pharisee, is that process has started already with Jesus. To which the answer, what are you talking about, Wait a minute, you can't have an individual resurrection. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. No, 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 no. I'm not saying an individual resurrection. I'm saying the general resurrection has already begun with Jesus. Now, wait, Paul, that means heaven and hell are already open for business? You mean the judgment's already going on? Now, Paul doesn't get into that. He doesn't
Right.
because he thinks it's all going to be over soon, so he doesn't have to get poked with that. But after 2,000 years, I'm asking him, as it were, okay, Paul, now, on the one hand, your timing is way off, but on the other, I'm hearing you say heaven, hell, judgment, resurrection is already operational. And I don't find that wrong because I watch the evening news and I see us working very hard across the world to build up heaven and hell as present options, not future locations. And yeah, I think we're all responsible, including myself. You know, if I had to account for everything I've done in my life that makes the world a worse place, I'm not talking if you want about, you know, before we knew anything about climate change or anything else. I what I'm taking from Paul is a vision of cosmic justice, however you explain it. And I certainly don't explain it the way he does.
Right.
So that's what I'm finding relevant.
Hello, everybody. If you like the content of this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, you can send me a message at midlifeawareness.podcast@gmail.com.
Oh, we're going to get into a little bit more about that here in a little bit, because that is basically the gist of what this book is all about was evolution and the cosmic justice. And because that was going back to Jesus and Paul, because that is a major shift, is it not? Because during that time, the primary thought was ascension, and Jesus and Paul comes along, and for Paul, it was obviously, this was after Christ was crucified, so Paul's message became Christ crucified and resurrection. And the major shift was from focusing, Jesus talks about the kingdom. Well,
Yeah.
Jesus's thought and Paul's thought was the kingdom is now, the kingdom is here. Whereas the major shift, if I'm correct here, the major shift from the thought of we go through this life and then we have a big afterlife afterwards, that's where everything else is going to occur. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, let me look at those two words, ascension and resurrection. And I'm taking it back to the first century. You probably know that this is the way I do with everything. Anything you bring up, I'm going to say, what did that mean when the first people talked about it? Meant it. Then I will talk about it's relevant. I will. I'm not going to leave stuff back there like the Supreme Court does so often, leave it back in the past. If it's a document that talks to the ages, as the authors claim, then I want to know two things. Initial challenge, what it meant when it was first talked about or written, and present relevance. And if it has no present relevance, then what you do is you bury it with all due respect, and you say it's done its job, but we move on. So in the first century, I would say it was transculturally accepted that an individual, let me say Romulus, who was the founder of the Roman Empire, let's say, or Moses, who was the founder of, let's say, the Jewish religion, upon their death, didn't simply molder into dust, as it were. However you explained it, their spirit or their soul or their being were taken up to the gods, if you're talking about Romulus or Caesar, are taken up to God, of course, if you're talking about uh, Moses. And that's, Josephus says that, so does Philo. They mention Deuteronomy says nobody knows where his grave is. They say, nobody knows his grave. That's because he was taken up to God. That's like the wallpaper of the Mediterranean world. You could say, I don't believe your guy was taken up. Or that might be impolite to say that, but you could say it. But what you couldn't do was say it couldn't happen, because people believed it could happen. You could argue about this guy or that guy. So that's ascension. And if you could imagine, excuse me, if you could imagine on Easter Sunday morning, let's take it literally. Let's take it completely literally for the moment. If you could imagine Easter Sunday morning, let's say you find an empty tomb and people start having visions of Jesus. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. What you would expect, what you would really expect, is claims of ascension. Again, as I say, anyone could deny them. But if you and I were there on Easter Sunday morning, taking it all literally, and I might say, empty tomb, Jesus has ascended to God. And you might say, no, somebody stole the body. Those are your options. I'm not convinced anyone ever said resurrection before Paul did in the 50s, of course, before the gospel was written, in the 50s, because he's a Pharisee. He wants to keep the resurrection because that's part of his own faith as a Jew. So, the great bringing together of two things, the pivot for Paul is, so we were right. We Pharisees were right about the resurrection because it has begun with Jesus. And that's why I, Paul, am a Pharisaic, Messianic, Christic. That's why I accept Jesus as the Messiah Christ. Because in a way, to put it crudely, he has vindicated the Pharisaic faith. Not because he's a Pharisee, but because he has begun the general resurrection. That's Paul. And I can't find it clearly anywhere before Paul. So what about Mark? Mark, of course, is written in the 70s.
Right.
20 years later.
Let's get into metaphor, because this is a pretty big concept. Pretty much in this book, but one of the things that I've enjoyed with reading your books is not only do you talk to the Christians or the Christian realm, but you're also talking to atheists. And the one thing that I've kind of seen is the fact that, to be real honest with you, atheists and Christians really don't have that much difference, because if you're taking a literal interpretation of, to say, the Bible, the literal translation will get you fundamentalism if you're a Christian, or it could turn you into an atheist, right?
Yeah.
And so metaphor becomes huge when you're talking about different concepts and things like that in the Bible. So in your mind, where does metaphor fit in? And I got a follow-up question after that too.
Okay, thank you. I'd like not to get two questions at the same time, because I'm finding after 90, I'll forget the second question by the time I've answered the first one. Anyway, metaphor is rock bottom basic for me. Let me see. We're very good at the small metaphors that we make.
Right.
Nobody, if a child said to you, why do we say that clouds sail across the sky? They're really not sailing. We say, oh, it's a metaphor. We're thinking of the blue sea and the blue sky and the white sails and they're really not sailing, but they're kind of like white sails on a blue, It'd bore it if you tried to explain it to an adult. And if somebody said to you as an adult, they don't really say, you'd probably say, oh, get a life. I mean, if I were to say to my wife in the morning, I think the sun is up, and she started giving me a lesson. No, it's really not that the sun is up. It's that the word, you say, oh, come on, unless you were joking. The sun also rises. Yeah, as the world turns. Come on. We understand that now. But the big metaphors, the metaphors that make us, we don't see, and I suspect this, I have no idea about this. I don't know if fish see water. I don't know if fish know, hey, we're swimming around here, in the water. Big metaphors that were inside them. Now, for example, in the 1930s, Hitler had a metaphor for Germany. Let's call it the Third Reich to keep it simple, or the Thousand-Year Reich. People who believed that metaphor started to act accordingly, making conclusions from it, and they created a reality. So metaphor creates reality when it is lived. On the other hand, over here, Roosevelt had a metaphor, the New Deal. People started to try and live that metaphor and created a different reality. Now, both realities were going on in the 30s, and people were wagering their life on each one. Some metaphors don't work. So it's that, well, metaphor is simply the way we see it. Whichever way you see it, it is. It's all just perspective. No, it ain't, because there is a great big algorithm running the world, and it's called evolution. And whether you're a theist or an atheist, the algorithm rules. And if you're a theist, of course, your God has created the algorithm to run the world. So that's a metaphor. It's a way of seeing it. And if you live out your way of seeing it, you can judge, is it destroying us, the human race? That's what I want to judge. Maybe an individual can get away with it. Maybe you don't. So metaphor creates reality. And if somebody says, well, is it metaphorical or is it real? You're lost. The opposite to metaphorical is literal. The opposite to real is unreal. Metaphor creates reality if lived. If everyone shrugs their shoulder and says, well, couldn't care less, then they're living a different metaphor. They're not out of metaphor. So, for example, now, Jesus was crucified. I think that is a literal statement. Jesus was executed by Roman power. I think that is a legitimate historical statement. You could be wrong, sure, but these are historical statements which I accept as a historian. Jesus was executed legally by Roman power.
Right.
Pilate wasn't having a nasty day or something like that. Now, Paul looks at that. That's a fact for him. Now, watch how metaphor starts. He could say, well, Pilate must have got it right. He was the law, so Jesus must have done something wrong. So too bad. I'm with Pilate. Sure. That's accepting the fact metaphorically. It is, you're putting it into the justice of the Roman system, which you've already accepted. Paul now has this problem. His idea of God, of course, is absolutely theistic, of course. So for Paul, here's his problem. And this is the heart of Paul for me. When I listen to this, it's in 1 Corinthians, the first chapters, I hear the heartbeat of Paul. Why did God, now watch my verb, allow, decide, decree, permit that Jesus, the Messiah, would come to earth, I'll use Pauline language, and be executed by Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever known, which boasted above all of its law and order and justice and peace and civilization. They looked across the Irish Sea and saw the savage Irish and said, yeah, they're not even civilizable. Same up with the German forests. We don't civilize them because they're not civilizable. The Greeks were civilizable. The Celts were civilizable in France. So the boast is civilization. Now, why? This is Paul's question. And his answer to this is his enabling vision, I'm going to call it. Take that away, and Paul just collapses into a heap of whatever. What God allowed, permitted, decreed, take your verb, the Messiah to be executed legally by Rome. God wanted to reveal to humanity the savage heart of civilization. Not just of Rome, but of the great vaunts about justice and law and peace and everything that's magnificent. And what happens? Confronted with a Jesus, they executed him. Now, the only way I can kind of honestly try and appreciate that, because I don't think like that for Paul, but if Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested, let us say, after his I Have a Dream speech, put in jail, accused of treason, and executed, what would that do to somebody who was a fervent follower of Martin Luther King, who had dedicated their life to him? They have to either decide that, well, it was a disastrous mistake and he must have been evil or something, or there's something terribly wrong with us, our government. So that's what Paul begins with. The Messiah has been executed by Rome. Now, he could say, well, that's Rome, but no, he knows Rome is civilization. He knows they're both.
Right.
They don't claim, well, we're Rome, we're just a little bit better than the Greeks. No, their claim is Roman civilization is like a redundancy. We are civilization. So now, the second thing he has to ask is, well, if God allowed that to happen, is that all God did? And so when you're looking at Corinthians, he starts off with the executed Jesus and ends chapter 15 with the resurrected Jesus. No, God has also revealed the cosmic justice of God. So the savage heart of civilization is revealed by the crucifixion. The cosmic justice of God has already begun and been revealed by the resurrection. This is the heart of Paul. And that's why I could say that for me, Paul is really about Jesus, because I consider that the execution, and that's all he's interested in. If you say, well, Paul, we have all these sayings of Jesus, he did this, Paul would say, well, yeah, that's nice, that's important, that's good. But Paul wants to talk about crucifixion, and let me say execution, because we've domesticated crucifixion. That doesn't shock us. In the first century, crucifixion shocked you, of course. Execution should shock us. Legitimate, legal execution, I mean, not just a lynching mob or something. So Paul knows that he wasn't there in Galilee listening to Jesus. He's a little bit diffident about it, to be honest with you. When he makes that statement, well, if we knew Paul according to the flesh, we don't know him that anymore. Yeah, he's a little bit, I'm as good as Peter, but he knows Peter walked with Jesus and he didn't. So he's quite ready to focus on the execution and resurrection. I appreciate the fact that we have both. We have the teaching of Jesus, so that I know exactly why he was executed. He wasn't executed as a criminal, really. He was executed for opposing Roman law and order.
Right.
So that is important for me. And I think if you pushed Paul and said, wait a minute, now, this Jesus guy you're talking about, he was a runaway slave, right? And he should have been put to death. That Paul would have had to back up into the life of Jesus. He'd have to, because anyone, the presumption in the first century, if you heard of a crucifixion, no qualifications, he's either a runaway slave or he is a violent rebel. So, Paul, I'm listening to you. You're talking about the execution of Jesus. I'm very sympathetic. I don't like executions, but I'm presuming your guy, Paul, is either, as I said, a runaway slave or a violent revolutionary. Which is he? And then Paul would have to be able to say, well, he was teaching, and then you go into what Paul, excuse me, somebody like the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, he had to know it.
Hello, everybody. If you like the content of this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, you can send me a message at midlifeawareness@gmail.com.
My follow-up question to that was, can we get metaphor wrong? And I think you started to maybe go down that road just a little bit in that first answer. And I don't necessarily mean the denotative approach or the literal meaning of something. Okay. Okay. My friend Susie, she runs like a deer, right? The literal meaning is she runs like a deer.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not what I'm talking about.
No.
But what I'm talking about more is the connotative or figurative, because in that scenario, Susie is a deer.
Yeah.
Okay. So, first of all, I think we get metaphor totally wrong on how we look at it. And number two, can you take the wrong meaning from a metaphor?
Well, let me do something risky. We had an election here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fact. Now, if millions of people think the election was stolen from the person who should have won, let me keep it vague, and millions of people think, no, it was a fair election, and the person who claimed to have won did. Now, think of those as metaphors. That's what they are, actually. We don't like to use that word. We might say interpretations. We might even say lies about somebody else's. But if we live according to that, supposing we live according to the stolen election metaphor, and supposing that becomes the future of America, that is that basically everyone, 90%, start to believe that. That's a metaphor taking over our lives. We're living a metaphor then. And it doesn't make any difference if you want to, well, you're really living an interpretation. Okay, that's metaphor works by interpretation, of course. You could say it's also a vision. You could say it's a way of seeing. Yes, yes. But it's going to dictate your life. Either way you do it. And if you say, well, I don't care, I'm just going to stay neutral, I won't vote, then you're taking a different metaphor. So, yes, the example I gave of the Third Reich was a disastrous metaphor. But it didn't look disastrous in 1933, 34, 35, 36, unless you were Jewish, of course, 37, right. 38. You know, there came a time when it wasn't working. So the danger with metaphors is you don't know maybe until it's too late. So you watch very carefully by watching history. Certain metaphors have been tried before. We have a pretty good idea how they work. Basically you could judge, but that's our life. That's our precarious life. That's how we survive on this earth, by coming up with some things. Now, what we have going for us is that we can change.
Yeah.
I don't take that for granted. I mean, some animals can't. If they're carnivores and they run out of their food, they're going, it's the end of their species. We can change. And secondly, generally, we have enough time to change before it's too late. I call those the forgiveness of evolution and the mercy of evolution. Forgiveness of evolution is we can change. I'm speaking anthropomorphically. And there's a time before it's too late. So the great metaphor in the Bible that people are scared of is war.
Mhm.
Don't see anything else. You beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, and that stops war, so everything's fine. They never dreamt that the day might come when the plow and the pruning hook might be the problem, when agriculture might be our problem. We say, how could that be? How could we end up accelerating global warming? How did we end up doing that? It doesn't seem wrong. It seems the normal thing to do, all the things we did, and we ended up where we are. And there's not a glimpse of that really in the Bible. You could say God so loved the world, but no, come on. There, the things that threaten us now are already lapping the threat of weapons of mass destruction. And I'm not trying to be apocalyptic or anything else about it. It simply is that watch your metaphors.
And that gets really into the crux of your book. We're not captivated by just one. We don't live in one reality. Okay. There's different types of realities that we all live in, different kind of backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and all that. For Paul, we had talked about some of them in your book, the first Paul, but um, you talk about the Roman realm, you talk about a Jewish realm, and you talk about the uh, Messianic Christic realm. And so for this book, you introduced a fourth realm to that. And that's really, I think, in my opinion, that's where the base of this book comes into. So can you go into what your fourth realm is and why it was so crucial for this book?
Yes. Basically, what started it was this. During COVID, I had an awful lot of extra time on my hands when I was,
We all did.
I did, I was quarantined, not because I had COVID, but that was fine. Um, I read three philosophers. Jacob Taube is a German, Alain Badiou, a French, and Giorgio Agamben, an Italian, all of them writing about Paul, and all of them insisting, well, Jacob Taube is Jewish, insisting that we are not writing as Christians. And Badiou goes out of his way to say, "Oh, I'm not a Christian." Yeah, okay, we got it. We got it. You're French. But what they insist on, we're just reading Paul as a philosopher, an ancient philosopher, like we might read Plato or Aristotle. We think he is relevant to the 21st century. Okay, so I read all of them. Now, I'm not ready to take them on as philosophers. I just read them on Paul, pulled into their own philosophy. And what it convinced me is, hey, I can do a much better job on Paul than you can by taking all of the history of Paul that we know, all the Roman stuff, by being able to read Luke Acts as well. I can do a better job on Paul on your principles to make him relevant to the 21st century, not by looking at him not through Christianity and theology or philosophy, but through evolution. That was, they inspired me. That's why I have quotations from them at the epigraph of every chapter. Just, it made me think. Thank you. And what made me think was, why would I jump from looking at Paul through the lens, say, of theology to the lens of philosophy? Why not through the one that we all know about for the last 200 years that's running the world, evolution? If you're busy being non-theist, let's be evolutionary. So the challenge really, the fundamental challenge of the book, Dennis, you're quite right. Behind all the stuff about Paul is, look, could we bracket for 2,000 years the debate between theists and atheists? Or I don't believe in the Bible. I do think the Bible is important. And could we look at what I call the transcendental algorithm that runs the universe? which we've known about, not more than 100 years. Cosmic evolution. I'm not just talking about Darwin. I think it was unfortunate that we got Darwin first. So we got human evolution first. Then we almost ignored cosmic evolution when it came along because we were all arguing about whether the apes and all the rest of it. I wish that'd be the other way around. That we first had come up with cosmic evolution and that people had been kind of willing to accept that before they heard of, well, within cosmic evolution, there is human evolution. And this is human evolution, just a speck within the 14 billion years of cosmic evolution. I think we'd be in much better shape. But anyway, so I'm talking about cosmic evolution. I'm talking about the Big Bang. I'm talking about how matter and energy, time and space all arrived at the same time about 14 billion years ago. That's the algorithm that runs our universe. I don't know of any other term for it. It's an algorithm. And when you're running under an algorithm, as we all know too well, there's constraints. Every time you make a phone call and you're told this has been recorded to improve the quality, and you want to say, excuse me, when may we expect the improvement in the quality to begin? It's just an algorithm. They put the thing in, and no human being is doing anything. It's never been used really for improving quality or training. It's just so you won't get mad at press 1, press 2. Anyway, it's an algorithm. And for example, we can accelerate, as we have done, weapons of mass destruction to the point that we know we can destroy the world in about a half dozen different ways. We now see a second way we can destroy the world by accelerated climate change. And I'm always talking about accelerated, by the way. Climate change has always been operational, but slowly, so we could adapt to it. Now, all of a sudden, we are accelerating it, and we can't adapt to it fast. So, and then there is a third one, which is overpopulation. And by overpopulation, I don't mean too many people. I mean too many people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah. There's lots of room elsewhere, but too many people in a place they want to get out of. And other people in a place they want to stay and keep them out. Overpopulation is known as immigration. When it comes as a problem. Otherwise, I came to this country in 1951 on a student visa. There was no problem. I came back to this student in 1961 on a green card, or whatever you call it. Again, no problem. Overpopulation is not that the world cannot hold. It's that it cannot hold with this number here and this number there. So we have already now 3 major cosmic crises operational in the world. And it really does not take an apocalyptic or a scary worldview to say, we should be thinking about these. So that's basically what's behind the book. And it's asking especially, okay, I want to think of myself as being bilingual. Right. In the sense that I can speak in the church sanctuary to fellow Christians and say, look, we got warnings about this from Paul. So when you read this, hear this. Don't get into, well, the next life. Hear this. And I could say, okay, in the public square, if anyone wants to listen to me, please don't tell me you're an atheist or a theist. I actually fundamentally don't care. I really don't, because I care, first of all, if you're a theist, have you accepted that your God runs the world by evolution? If you are, you've got no argument from me. What happens off in some future, I won't even argue with you. I really will not argue with you. I will disagree with you if you want to ask me. Mm-hmm. But it's like a giant divine red herring. that let's argue about this and we won't argue about this. Let's argue about this and we won't even recognize this. Our God's going to take care of it somehow. Don't worry. We'll be stopped at the last minute. Just before we go over the precipice, God will stop us. I don't see the evidence for that in human history or in human evolution. So I would like to ask people, could you bracket the Christian, non-Christian, Bible, don't care about the Bible, bracket all that. If you're Christian, hear the biblical message. If you're not, hear the evolutionary message. They're saying the same thing.
Well, the book is called Paul the Pharisee. This is your latest book out of the many that you have written. And Dom, I thank you for your time today. We're going to start wrapping things up here, but on a personal level, is this it for you, you think?
Well, as you know, I'm 90 and a half at the moment. Thank God I'm in good health. Forget things every now and then, but no, basically.
Don't we all?
Why did I go in here? What am I doing in this? But basically, thank God, good health, good energy. I'm doing very fine. I do a treadmill every day, and I've been exercising all the rest of it. So I don't know. That's the honest answer, Dennis. Right now, I'm focusing on this.
Yeah.
And there's some friends and I working on whether Spanish translation and things like that. So I don't know, but then I didn't know I was going to write this book. Honestly, I thought I was finished with Paul, with the books I'd written on Paul, because I'm still primarily interested in Jesus. And I'm interested because I think the resurrection of Jesus is part of the historical Jesus, because it's the claim about an historical figure. I take it metaphorically.
Right.
But the same way as if I was a Roman historian and the claim is that Caesar has ascended among the gods and therefore the Roman Empire has been watched over, I would have to handle that, of course. I could say I don't believe it literally, but I have to handle it as a metaphor. It makes a huge difference if they said, no, everyone obliterated his name and Tiberius destroyed all mention of it. That would be part of Roman history. So you don't leave out the metaphors. So it's part of the historical Jesus for me. And therefore I disagree, with all due respect, to Father Ray Brown or Father John Meyer, who end their historical Jesus discussions with the tomb. No, not the empty tomb, but the tomb, the burial. Right. Nope. Face the resurrection.
All right. So again, thank you for coming by. And on the way out, is there anything that you would like to just sum up what we talked about? If there's something that we didn't talk about here that you would like to go ahead and mention, I think we mainly hit the big points, I think, in my estimation for the book. But is there anything that you'd like to either sum up or just add to from what we talked about?
Well, I've been using a couple of slogans for advertising.
Yeah.
And one of them is, who's afraid of the big bad Paul?
I like that one.
My answer is most of the New Testament.
Right.
Most of the New Testament. That's fair enough. They post-Pauline letters and Luke Acts are doing a big job of de-radicalizing Paul and re-Romanizing Paul. So I'd leave people with that. Who's afraid of the big bad Paul? Most of the New Testament. And thank you, Dennis, very, very much for having me and for reading the book.
Oh, it's been a blessing. It really has. So again, thank you for coming on board here. And that's a fitting way to because we didn't get into, what is it with Luke? I mean, what he why he just does not like Paul, it seems like sometimes. So
let me say one more thing that if I
Yeah,
go too
sorry.
long, no. Luke is the only one in the entire New Testament, the figure, whoever is the
Right.
part, okay, who gets it right. I mean, he sees the future and he says it's not Jewish Christianity that's coming, it's Roman Christianity. And so the story that Luke tells ends when Paul hits Rome, and there the story ends. Luke says Rome, the city, is now God's new holy city. And I have to say, okay, that would make Paul turn over in his grave and Matthew start screaming. But yes, Luke, you got it right. That's the future. You saw Constantine in the distance, as it were, across a couple of 100 years. You saw the future, and the future is Roman Christianity. So, okay, Luke, I get it. You're going to mold Paul into that matrix, whether he likes it or not, kicking and screaming. You're going to make Peter the dominant one in your Acts of the Apostles. So I respect what you're doing. I don't think you're making a mistake. I think you're making Peter, not Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. You're preparing the way for Constantine.
And it did come to fruition. So he was on board. So.
Certainly did.
All right, John Dominic Crossan, thank you so much for coming on board again today. Love the book, Paul the Pharisee. Out there on Amazon, go to Dom's website, and you can get all the information there too. So, Dom, thank you again very much, and I will talk to you somewhere down the road, I'm sure.
Thank you, Dennis.